Instead of pursuing the enemy, the Egyptian troops stay behind to plunder the camp, to the fury of their general and emperor.
In Pharaoh's own words, Thutmose III's own words, taken from his daybook, which we see here in this hieroglyphic text, he said, "If only my army had not given its attention to the plundering of the enemy camp, Megiddo would have been taken in a single day."
Thutmose has won his first great battle, but his inexperience and his troops' lack of discipline have let the enemy escape. As the Egyptians gather their loot, the Canaanite coalition holds up inside Megiddo. Throughout its long history, Megiddo has been a formidable fortress. Today, a team of students excavates the city level by level. They dig through the sand of thousands of years of civilization before reaching the city foundations from the time of Thutmose III. The fragments of pottery they collect are the best way to date the different layers. When they find foundations from more than 3,000 years ago, they reconstruct the shape of the fortress and of the buildings inside. It turns out that Megiddo was not a fortress with great defensive walls. They weren't necessary.
There was a palace in a certain part of the city. We know where the gate was. We know where the temple was. So the two most important components of a city like this, their location is well known. And then we know that there was no major fortification surrounding the site, but houses built connected to each other and forming some sort of a belt of houses which gave protection to the people inside.
Megiddo's fortified houses, perched atop a steep hill, protect the king of Kadesh and his men. According to ancient sources, the siege lasts for 7 months. How they could hold out for so long has always been a mystery, until archaeologists discovered remnants of a sophisticated supply system. A huge tunnel dug deep into the mountain supplied the city with water.
Thutmose III says they held out for 7 months, so they obviously had enough water and enough food. Now, what he doesn't say is how they finally captured the city. They must have breached the walls, they must have knocked down the city gates, or they paid somebody to open up the gates, something very common in antiquity. They must have done.
Whatever happened, Megiddo finally fell. The Egyptians at last defeat their enemies. The king of Kadesh and his allies are brought before the pharaoh. It's time for Thutmose to show his skills as statesman, to find a way to rule this conquered territory so far away from his capital in Thebes. Challenging the pharaoh is like blasphemy. Violators can expect no mercy. The generals demand their enemies be put to death. But the king of Kadesh begs for the lives of his family. Once more, Thutmose ignores his generals and follows his own instincts, dealing with his enemies.
At that point, what happened became standard imperial practice for 4 centuries. They were forced to take an oath immediately, never again to rebel against Pharaoh and Egypt. At the same time, it was made plain to them that they had to hand in taxes, the same kind of taxes that the Egyptian peasants had to hand in whenever Pharaoh or his ministers asked for them. And finally, they were obliged to give up their young children.
Thutmose spares the lives of the rebel leaders, but he sends their children to Egypt as hostages. They will guarantee that their fathers never again disobey the Pharaoh's commands. On the Nile, they will be raised as Egyptians. The girls will stay in Egypt. The boys will one day return to their homeland as vassal kings in the service of the Pharaoh.
As an Egyptian, if you're trying to conquer this region, it makes much more sense to capture the cities and then turn them into an Egyptian capital city, an Egyptian stronghold, and then rule it, which is what they do. They rule this area, they rule Canaan for the next 300 or 400 years from cities like Jerusalem, like Megiddo, like others. It makes perfect sense. Why would you destroy it when it makes much more sense to occupy it?
Thutmose returns home in triumph, proving himself a worthy pharaoh and a powerful general. Throughout the land, Egyptians hail the victory over the king of Kadesh and the conquest of Megiddo. Priests throw open the doors to the sanctuaries of the imperial gods. The spoils of war, the enemy's gold, are offered to the god who made this victory possible. Amun, supreme god of the kingdom and of the fledgling empire. In Thebes, the capital, life feels safer, more secure, but that feeling is deceptive. The main enemy, the Mitanni, have by no means been vanquished, and they are plotting their revenge. Thutmose tightens his hold on Canaan, but his victory is fragile. He decides to crush the Mitanni in their own country.
He did it only after the first 4 or 5 campaigns that consolidated his hold on Palestine, what we would call today Palestine, the south. Then he directed his next campaigns against the Lebanese coast. And to do that, it would be much more useful and easier, perhaps, to load his army into transports and send them by water.
Ancient records show that Thutmose planned a land-sea campaign against the Mitanni, but archaeologists weren't convinced it was possible. Hundreds of model boats found in tombs and countless temple reliefs show how important ships were to the lives of every Egyptian. But could they sail the high seas?
We know, for example, that Thutmose III and his men are in contact with Crete, with mainland Greece at this time. You can only get there by ship. So we've got the representations on the walls of Rekhmire and other officials of Thutmose III showing the ships docked at the Egyptian ports.
Despite images and inscriptions, there was no archaeological proof that Egyptians could build seagoing ships. Then, a few years ago beside the Red Sea, researchers discovered remnants of an Egyptian seaport, one of only 2 ever found. A network of at least 7 galleries dug deep into fossilized coral. Tangible evidence that Egyptians could not only sail on the Nile, but also on the open sea. International experts found pottery, the remains of ships' timbers, and texts recording state-sponsored trading ventures. But the caves held an even bigger surprise. Deep inside these storehouses, scientists found the proof. Cargo and equipment left by Egyptian sailors. Hundreds of meters of ancient ships' ropes, remains of a seagoing people.
The Egyptians built cargo ships that were capable of long journeys hundreds of years before Thutmose III.
Marine archaeologist Cheryl Ward has excavated sections of wooden planks. She needs just a few fragments from the stern to reconstruct the entire ship. These vessels were much sturdier and bigger than the boats used on the Nile. Each ship was made from 20 trees. It could carry 40 people and 17 tons of freight. With 14-meter wide sails, the ship could travel at 6 knots, 3 times faster than donkeys on land.
Another reason this piece of wood is really special is that it's got great examples of the way the Egyptians held their ships together. They used big pieces of wood we call tenons, and they fit inside holes in each plank. We see the ends of each tenon here. They're in pairs, and you can imagine another plank jammed up here next to it with these great pieces of wood holding it together. There's also here what we call a ligature. They threaded strips of copper through here like ribbon and tied the end of another plank to it so that the seam between that plank and the keel was as tight as possible.
This construction kit approach made it possible to easily dismantle the ships, just like the Egyptian chariots. Sailors could transport the pieces overland and reassemble the ship at their destination. That destination was the empire of the Mitanni, Thutmose's archenemy, 900 kilometers from Egypt. Thutmose sails north with 170 ships and a huge army. They disembark, carrying a few disassembled ships with them to cross the river Euphrates. Gathering on the far side of the river, the Egyptian soldiers prepare for war. But the great battle the Egyptians geared up for never happens. The Mitanni have retreated into the Asian plains. Thutmose destroys their cities, staking his territory and declaring victory. His war diaries end soon after his Euphrates campaign. A royal stele on the Euphrates shore marks the furthest boundary of his empire. Thutmose has reached the geographical limits of his military power. Egypt, too, will never reach further. At last, Thutmose and his soldiers can return home. No Egyptian wants to live here, so far from Egypt. The Nile is the center of their world, paradise on earth. And so this ancient superpower kept mainly to itself, expanding only when it was reasonable and necessary.
Thutmose III seems to exemplify that old Egyptian interest in surrounding territories as a sphere of influence only. Not a formal empire, but just a sphere of influence in which the Egyptian messenger can go and tell the local chief, I want so-and-so. You have to comply with Pharaoh's wishes, and the chief will say, yes, sir, and do so.
Once again, Thutmose returns to Thebes in triumph, expanding the Egyptian sphere of influence as never before. No pharaoh's power had ever been greater. Thutmose has accomplished his life's work and banished the danger of foreign domination. To thank the gods for his victories, he extends the Temple of Karnak. And he decorates the walls with images of the exotic animals and plants he discovered on his campaigns. Like all of his ancestors, Thutmose is portrayed in the temple reliefs as the conqueror of Egypt's enemies.